Alright, as I promised, I was going to do this video for you encompassing chapter 6 and 7, which they're the most meatiest, the most numerous of things that you have to know. The stuff that are more this is this and this, I'm just going to refer to make sure that you do understand those information. Okay, so we'll start with skeletal cartilage. Okay, based on the stuff you should know already from the lab, hyaline cartilage is going to have chondrocytes in it. It's going to have a matrix in it. Remember, it's a connective tissue, so there is not a lot of meat to it or substance to it, so you've got to have filler things. Matrix is going to be that filler thing. It's going to be on the ends of most bones. Okay, it's going to be part of the ribs. Okay, so it's really important, or is involved in a lot of systems. Respiratory system, so you can breathe. Nasal, which is another portion, so you've got portions of your nose that are going to be hyaline cartilage. Your external features, such as your nose. That's why they can fix your nose so easily, because it is hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is the second one. It's more elastic, hence the term, the name. It's more durable, which means it can go through a lot. People mess with their ears all the time. There's a good example of elastic cartilage. Okay, so it's the external ear, and then there's something called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is the thing that covers or protects food from going down the wrong quote-unquote tube between the esophagus, okay, and the trachea. So it has to be relatively durable because it's constantly being used. You eat all the time. So it has to be able to do its job and then not break or get damaged, because if it does so, you're not going to be able to eat without choking. Okay? Fiber cartilage is the next one. It has great tensile strength because it has parallel rows of chondrocytes and collagen fibers. And how it kind of does that is it'll be collagen fibers, then it'll have chondrocytes, then it'll have collagen fibers, etc. Okay, going through. So it does offer that strength. It is found where pressure and stretch is needed, so it doesn't damage what it's protecting. Great place to think of it is going to be in your intervertebral discs, which we've talked about. Okay? It's also found in your knee. Obviously your knee does a lot of stuff, so it has to be really strong and durable. The last cartilage is growth cartilage. Okay? It has to be strong as well. Okay? It's always found in two ways. Okay? It's appositional, which means the growth cartilage is found on the outside, forming cells of bone. Okay? So it's constantly adding new matrix to the area, so your bone is changing. Secondly, it's found in the interstitial area, which is interstitial means inside. That's where you're going to have chondrocytes in lacunae causing growth to occur. Alright? Classification of bones. You know we classify bones. Where they're found. Are they axial or appendicular? What's axial mean? What's appendicular mean? If you don't know this one answer, you need to start over and start reading, because that's the most basic of questions I can give you on this exam. Axial, head, vertebra, ribs, sternum, sacrum, coccyx. Okay? Appendicular, everything else. We also term these by their shape. Long bones, humerus, tib-fib, okay? Femur. Those are long bones. They're long. Okay, they have a longer shaft. Okay? Short bones, they're almost cubed in shape. Okay? They're almost like the sesamoid bones, your wrists, your ankles. Best example of short bones. Flat bones, they're generally curved. Think about a rib. Think about your sternum. Think about your scapula. And think about your skull. Okay? And then of course irregular bones, that's going to be made up of your vertebra. You've studied vertebra in the lab, you know it has a very odd shape, so it's irregular. Also, hip bones are considered irregular because they're not long, they're not flat, they're not sesamoid, so they have to be irregular right now. 7 functions all bones must have. Well, they support. They make up your framework of your body, so they have to support what you're doing. Protection. Your skull is protecting your brain. Your ribs are protecting your lungs and your heart. Okay? Movement. Muscles are going to attach to bones, allowing for movement. Okay? Mineral and growth storage factor, we just discussed how calcium and phosphorus are found in bones and how those are utilized for growth. Blood cell formation, okay? What marrow is that found in? The answer is red marrow. Triglyceride or fat storage, what marrow is that? Yellow marrow. Hormone production, I told you it makes osteocalcin. Osteo again means bone. Calcin can refer to like a calcium type product. You should know that. And that's going to regulate the growth of bone. Okay? Let's see. In the manner of studying bones in a large scale way like we were doing in the lab today, that's where you're looking at the gross structure of the bone. You're looking at it as a whole. When we're looking at it as a whole, keep in mind about let's talk about the skull. It looks smooth on the outside. If it looks smooth on the outside, it's compact bone. Now remember, based on the picture, internal to this was the spongy bone. It looks like sponge or a honeycomb shape. Each of those pieces that make up the spongy bone are called trabeculae. Okay? Generally speaking, if it goes compact, spongy, compact, the spongy bone is now called dipole. If it goes compact, spongy, it stays the term spongy. Long bones, okay, almost all long bones have a shaft, ends in a membrane, okay? So let's change those terms to more appropriate terms, okay? The diaphysis is what's better known as the shaft, so it's the long portion of the bone, okay? It's going to have a central medullary canal that's going to contain your yellow bone marrow. Then you've got the epiphysis. That's the head or the top and the bottom of the long bone. Okay? These are generally a lot broader. They're generally rounder than the central diaphysis. They have a thin layer of hyaline cartilage covering the surface for joint movement and stress. And you're going to see the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate is the area that's still made of hyaline cartilage when you're growing, where it can be added to by osteoblasts to allow you to get longer or taller. Okay? We have membranes covering the bones. The periosteum is a double layer on the external surface of bones. The outer layer is more fibrous. The inner layer is an osteogenic layer, which means it's the layer making new bone. Within the periosteum, you do have blood and nerves. Okay? Again, the periosteum is important to enter the marrow cavity. You have to have a place for the nutrients to get into. Any specific foramen or small hole, which is foramina, has a name nutrient foramina. Foramina means nothing more than small hole. Foramen, big hole. Foramina, very small hole. Periosteum is going to be secured to the underlying bone by Sharpey's fibers, which are collagen fibers. Very hard to remove. Remember I talked about skinning a deer and removing the meat. The endosteum, connective tissue membrane, covers the internal bone surface. So if I was to remove all the marrow, you're going to have the endosteum covering that whole surface internally. Okay, endo means inside. Okay, all right, the cells of the bone that we're talking about, okay, we have osteogenic cells. I told you the other term for osteogenic cells are stem cells. Okay, those are mitotically active. Those are going to be stimulated to differentiate into specific cells when needed. Osteoblasts are bone-forming cells. Again, they're mitotic. They secrete a mixture of collagen, calcium, and binding proteins which are utilized to make bone, that hardens to make bone. Okay. We have osteocytes. Osteocytes are nothing more than mature bone cells. Okay. They maintain bone matrix would be the basic function. Osteoclast, okay, those are the ones that break down or reabsorb bone. Okay. They can differentiate into macrophages to destroy anything that's surrounding any part of the bone that needs to be broken down. And you have bone lining cells. Those are flattened cells found on the surface of bone only when remodeling is going on. I talked about bone markings briefly. Basically, all I want you to know that bone markings are important because it offers a place for ligaments, tendons, or muscles to attach to on the bone. Because remember, compact bone is supposed to be smooth. If it's smooth, it can't attach properly without the chances of it ripping off. So these markings allow it to attach much better. Okay? So that compact bone looks solid, but it also has to have these small entrance points to allow nerves and vessels to go through. Osteon is that structural unit for bone. Remember, it looks like if I were to cut down a tree, those circular visits, that's what it looks like. Okay. There's one type of canal I asked you to memorize. It's called Volkmann's canal. Remember, it goes and makes right angles that allows blood and nerve supply into specific areas of the periosteum to the central canal. Any matrix tube, by definition, is called a lamella. Okay. Running through each core of an osteon, remember it looks like a concentric ring till the center is actually open. That's where you're going to have a small blood supply and one nerve vessel. All right, functions or formation of a bony skeleton. Some people had some difficulty with this. Okay, so basically what's going to happen is you're going to start off in the womb late in the second month making cartilage bones. They're not bones yet. They're not hardened yet. They're cartilage, but they're in the shape of the bone that it needs to be in. So what happens is initially this image, this hyaline cartilage, it takes some bone is made, and it's made around the area what would be the shaft or the diaphysis. It's called a bony collar, excuse me. So it's going to go right around what's called the diaphysis. And what's going to happen as time goes on, you're going to have osteoclasts and osteoblasts fighting with each other. Not really fighting. But osteoblasts will be consistently laying bone from the middle out. And that includes the middle or the center of the long bone. Initially, that's great because it allows for a bud and the entrance of blood vessels and nerves. But we all know that there is a cavity in the center of the diaphysis where the yellow bone marrow must go. So what happens is after everything is laid, the blood vessels are coming in. Here comes the osteoclast breaking down the areas that need to be hollowed out. Basically, the diaphysis, until the entire bone is made. There's one part of the entire bone structure that the cartilage stays, and that is the epiphyseal plate. Remember, that's that growth plate that has to stay cartilage until the person is done growing, which is later in life, late teens. Okay? Pretty simple. I hope me talking to you like this, you get the basic drift of it. Okay? So then we have intramembranous ossification. Intramembranous, within a membrane ossification. This is for those flat bones. Your clavicle, your cranial, which is your skull. Okay? This is done in an entirely different way. So it's not done like long bones. What happens is mesenchymal cells, which those are cells from your younger years. Okay? Those are young baby fetal cells. Okay? Come in and cluster. So there's a large number of them that go into the center. Remember, I don't know. It could be 10, it could be 15, it could be 100. Don't know how as many is supposed to be there. The minute they all are together, they turn into osteoblast. Osteoblasts in your mind should trigger, these are the ones that make bone. You now have an ossification center when all of them are there and they've all turned into osteoblasts. This is going to produce your first trabeculae in the bones we've talked about. Around this center now, the osteoblasts form a circle. Okay? And as they form this circle, they're releasing all the bone matrix that I talked about. When they're releasing it, there's going to be a couple cells that inevitably get caught in that matrix, which is going to eventually harden. Well, instead of it causing these cells to die, it changes these cells into osteocytes. So they become mature bone cells that'll patrol the matrix because they got stuck in that area. Okay? I hope you're getting all this. It now becomes a calcified osteoid. That means that the whole matrix is now gotten hard, blood vessels are coming through, it looks like sponge, they call it woven bone. Okay, it now becomes covered by a membrane, the periosteum. Okay, the trabeculae continues to thicken as osteoblasts lay down more and more bone. Okay, and it grows the entire length of the bone. Okay. Osteocytes, remember keratinocytes, they grew from the bottom and went up. Chondrocytes are different. They're made at the upper surface in the proliferation zone, and they're pushed downwards towards the ossification zone when new bone is formed. Okay. Bone growth, bone remodeling. Growth is in length, remodeling is in girth. Okay? The negative bounce we talked about is osteoclasts and PTH. Okay? It's a negative feedback system. We briefly discussed the stress, that there has to be a stress region which absorbs stress so the bone doesn't break and you don't get hurt. So on a long bone like the femur, it's straight down the midline. I talked about Venus Williams. Remember, I talked about tennis. I talked about if you're utilizing a bone or an arm, particularly in a sport, let's say tennis, you're utilizing your right arm, your muscles are going to grow. Yay. But it's also going to be your bones getting larger for remodeling and repair. Okay? I talked about all the fractures. Make sure you know the different types of fractures, where they happen, what kind of happens on the fracture. I told you how they fix them. We talked about bone fracture and how it's repaired. So now it's aligned, it's stuck in a cast. How does it really heal? First thing is you did damage bone, which means you damaged blood and nerve supplies. That's why it's black and blue, and that's why you're in a lot of pain upon injury. So the first thing you form is a hematoma. Hematoma is important. It's calling everything into the area to fix. Okay? It helps let everyone know, everyone being the cells of your body, demonstrate where the damage is so they can come in and fix it. So within about 3 days, capillaries are going to now grow into the hematoma. Phagocytic cells are come in there and clean it all out. You're going to have fibroblasts, cartilage, osteogenic type cells, fibroblasts, fibroclasts, all that's going into the cell to try to clean it up and rebuild. Okay? Again, chondrocytes are now going to make the cartilage, which is the precursor for bone. Same as when you were in your mama's tummy. Okay? This is called a fibrocartilaginous callus. Next, okay, within this callus that I just told you about, you're now going to have trabeculae, which is part of spongy bone, okay, which is going to make spongy bone. So now it is not a fibrocartilaginous callus. It is now considered a bony callus. This is up to 2 months it takes to do this. Lastly, you're going to have the spongy bone that has complete, you've completely filled up the area that's damaged. You're going to have any compact bone also be complete and finished. You're not going to be able to tell on an x-ray that there is any fracture still there. Now you have a healed fracture. We talked about some of the diseases: osteomalacia, poor mineralization, rickets, that's osteomalacia for a child. Okay, osteoporosis, that's bone deficiency, calcium deficiency within your bone, mostly in elderly, most in women, but can happen in men too, and can happen in young men as well. Okay, so there's no age difference. Okay. I also then began talking to you about the axial skeleton. What's contained in the axial skeleton, I've already said. It makes a longitudinal axis. It supports your brain and spinal cord. Most of the bones in the skull are flat except for the mandible. They're locked together by sutures. I told you and explained to you how that gives great strength on the suture for any problems that may occur within your brain. That sutures, sutures are important for that reason. I proved it to you by if there is too much pressure in your brain, they have to go in and actually cut a hole and relieve some of the pressure from you. They don't just rely on sutures because those won't fall apart. As far as knowing, you know, the different portions of the bones, I'm not going to repeat them in here. I gave them to you, and you're also studying them in the lab because you're going to have the lab practical soon. Make sure you know the bones. Just in general, it helps you in both the classes and identification. Temporal, let's see. I'm going to look for any definitions I can explain and help you out with. Fossa, like a step stool. Okay. Foramen's big hole. Foramina is small hole. Condyle is something you can sit on and it holds you in place when we're looking at it. Alright, Mexphora in the sphenoid, you know, greater wing, lesser wing. Celatertica looks like definitely horse's saddle. Ethmoid, you've got the crista galli, which is the point that's holding the dura mater of the brain, and it secures the brain in the proper position. You've got the cristiform plates, that's rooting the nasal cavity in proper position. Okay, it also has holes for the olfactory nerves. Mandible, strongest, free bone. Okay, it's positioned by condylar articulation. I told you about the mandibular foramina, the little holes that allows the nerves to come out. I told you about the maxillary bones. Most people don't know that the maxillary bones are fused together. It's really two bones. Orbits, 6 bones make up the orbits. Make sure you know those. Make sure you understand that the eyeballs are secured by fat and by muscles in that small little orbit space. I talked about the nasal cavity, that it's a lot larger than you can see. It has 3 areas that are called the concha, C-O-N-C-H-A. You have your superior, inferior, and middle. That offers for more spaces for mucus to be stored and kept to protect you in the long run. And that's all divided in half by a septum, so there's even more space in that area. You have the paranasal sinuses that are named for the areas that they're located in, the skull bones that they're part of. They're always containing mucus, they're always containing air. Air enters the sinus from the nasal cavity, drains the mucus that's already in there into the nasal cavity, and then the sinuses build again. Way to clean it out. Hyoid bone, it's not part of the skull, but it's always taught in this area. It's anchored by a narrow styloid ligament, and it raises and lowers the larynx during swallowing and speech. It also is an anchoring structure for your tongue. We talked about the vertebra, how many there are. That's simple enough for you to read. There's nothing further explanation. We talked about scoliosis, S-curve, fixed surgery, or one of those really uncomfortable braces. Kyphosis. Kyphosis, remember, is the hunchback that's mostly in women due to osteoporosis, lordosis, pregnant woman, or a beer gut, you decide, however it's called. Okay. I talked about intervertebral discs and the ligaments. Ligaments, you've got long ligaments that run the gamut of it. And then you have short ligaments that go from vertebra to vertebra, backing up the long ligaments. So it just helps protect it in both ways. The discs, remember we talked about the nucleus pulpus of the discs. We talked about the fibrous portion of the disc, which is on the outside, and why it's important. You look at an MRI and determine how to read an MRI to see herniation and bulging discs. Structure of the vertebra, you know what you have, you know what that is. You have that in lab as well. The first 2 vertebrae on a body are called what? Hopefully you said atlas and axis. Atlas gives you the ability to say yes. Axis gives you the ability to say no. Okay. So something no. Thoracic cage is going to include your thoracic vertebra, ribs, sternum, and cartilage. Costal cartilage make up part of the ribs. Make sure you understand false, true, and floating ribs and what they mean. We talked about the appendicular structure. Okay, we learned that, let me see, I'm getting some stuff that is. We learned that articulations on the skull is where the sutures are. We learned that articulations on the appendicular skeleton is what bone is it touching. So if you learn what the skeleton looks like, or where each of these bones are in reference to the other bones, you know that it's touching possibly more than one, like the humerus. The humerus is in the scapula, but it's also touching your radius and ulna, so on and so forth. For the bones of the hand, I'll do this now because you're going to have to memorize them for lab. Remember how they're in 2 layers. You know, they make 8 bones, so it's 4 on top of 4. So what I did is made up a numeric phrase which you probably won't like, but you may like it. It's Sally left the party to take Cindy home. So it starts at the top portion and it says Sally represents scaphoid, left lunate, and so on and so forth. That might help you in memorizing those bones. Male and female pelvis. I taught you the trick with the percentages and this little mind game. Tib, fib, a lot of femur. This is all stuff. Arch is the only thing that really isn't memorizing. Make sure you just understand that you're going to have 2 longitudinal, which is lengthwise, and 1's transverse, it goes side to side. Arches are made by how the bones are laid. Talus is the most important. We talked about brittle bone disease and how upsetting that was. We talked about the skull of a newborn. We know that they don't ossify completely upon birth, that they have to have fontanelles with them to be allowed to give birth without any damage, and to allow for brain growth immediately after birth. So it can be up to 2.5 years of age before fontanelles disappear. We talked about a cleft palate. And lastly, we talked about primary and secondary curvatures. Primary curvature is, you know, you've seen the people just hanging and bouncing their baby from their hand and laying across their forearm. That's a primary curvature. The thoracic and sacral curvature are already developed by birth. So they can do that without any discomfort to the infant. Secondary curvatures refer to cervical and lumbar. So those do not occur until probably the 3rd month. And what it is when they can be placed on their stomach and lift their head off the ground. Then you now know they're at second curvature, sorry. Okay? Okay. So I want you to study. That was chapter 6 and 7. I spoke fast. And I didn't say all the bones, which drove you nuts in class. I'm not saying them again. But I do want you to make sure you're studying and learning everything and getting ready and run through this stuff. It'll help you in both lab and lecture. I wish you the best.